on Tuesday, September 28, 2021, extensively deliberated on the general principles of the bill and read the second time the bill and subsequently referred the bill to the Committee on Power. Mr. President, after the reference of the bill to the Committee on Power, the Committee on Power invited stakeholders for a public hearing which took place sometimes this year for 2 days. Mr. President, the main objectives of the bill are on page 3, like I said earlier on. And the objectives are essentially, the bill seeks to, among other things, repeal the Electric Power Sector Reform Act 2005, which was enacted for the purpose of unbundling the sector. And after the unbundling of the sector, the power sector was privatized. About 23 sections of that Reform Act became invalid. And it became necessary for us to have a comprehensive electricity bill that is all-encompassing. Hence, the necessity for us to engage in what we are doing today. This bill seeks to consolidate all legislation in the Nigerian electricity supply industry and enact an Omnibus Electricity Act to provide for the ideal institutional framework that will guide the post-privatization phase of the industry. After the privatization, issues have arisen that needs an electricity act that take care of issues that were not anticipated in the first place. And this, accordingly, the main objective of the bills are provide an ideal legal and institutional framework to leverage on the modest gains of the privatization phase of the electricity power sector in Nigeria in order to accelerate growth in power generation capacity. B, improve utilization of generated power through increased investment in new technologies that will enhance transmission and distribution of generated power and minimize aggregate value chain losses. Reinvigorate the institutional framework for the reform of the Nigerian electricity supply industry initiated and implemented by the federal government. D, promote policies and regulatory measures that would ensure the expansion of power transmission networks in Nigeria in order to address any imbalance in the existing transmission infrastructure. Stimulate policies and regulatory measures to scale up efficient power generation, transmission, and distribution capabilities of the power sector in Nigeria with a view to achieving a national electricity access target and attaining the highest per capita power consumption in Africa within a reasonable time frame. And F, bring about policies that would address technological limitations of outdated infrastructure that are responsible for value chain losses in the Nigerian electricity supply industry by attracting sustainable investment in new and efficient power generation technology and revamping existing power plants, etc., etc. Mr. President, the committee invited all the major stakeholders in the power industries for this meeting, and altogether about 28 of the stakeholders, which is on page 4 to page 7. All the stakeholders in the power industry were invited, and public hearing took place starting from 28th of February to 1st March 2022. Mr. President, after the public hearing, on page 7 you see highlights of presentations of stakeholders. Majority and virtually all of the stakeholders agree that there was a need for us to have an electricity act, a codified electricity act that take care of the issues that I've already highlighted here. And so if we go to page 10, page 10, where you have the legislative summary. Mr. President, you see that paragraph 3, you see part 18, which deals with the dispute resolution, was substituted because in the previous act, the Reform Act, you didn't have a dispute resolution arrangement that was put in place to address these issues of electricity theft and other issues that are peculiar to the industry. This act have introduced that so that issues of electricity theft will be dealt with by a tribunal specially set up for this purpose and other related matters that are peculiar to the industries. So on page 11, Mr. President, the findings. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, having carefully analyzed the presentation and submission made during the public hearing, we hereby make the following observations and findings. The stakeholders unanimously supported the passage of the bill in view of its strategic relevance to the reform of the power sector in line with global best practices. B, that the passage of the bill will undoubtedly address the extant operational and statutory lapses confronting the Nigerian electricity supply industry since the conclusion of the privatization exercise of the power sector in 2013. C, that the bill will appraise and entrench in our power sector series of emerging trends as they relate to the power industry reform processes. D, that the enactment of the bill as an act of the National Assembly will bring about clarity and ensure uniformity of purpose between the statutory and regulatory stipulations on the preconditions for the declaration and establishment of medium-term electricity market and long-term market at the conclusion of the transitional electricity market stages in Nigeria. Now we're in the transitional stage now because government is still regulating part of the prices and all of that. When we move to medium term, what that means is that you have situations where they will be partly regulated in terms of price. Now government determine price. When we move finally to the long term, when the market is fully declared competitive, that means that demands and supply will determine the price. Government will no longer have a hand in it. It will be predicated fully on what is obtainable in the market. E, that the bill will provide for stipulations of policy measures that would attract investment across the Nigerian electricity supply industry, thereby stimulating economic growth, create jobs, and improve the living conditions of Nigerians. F, that the bill will provide a clear legal and institutional framework for the formulation and adoption of a national integrated electricity policy and implementation strategy. That the bill will eliminate, through policy and regulatory measures, barriers to investment in generation, transmission, distribution, and related subsector in the electricity industry in Nigeria. Mr. President, this one deals with situation where state, in the bill now, state can legally generate power, transmit, and distribute without any hindrance. Any individual who have the capacity can do same. That is a new introduction in the bill. It has now opened up so that any individual who have the capacity can go and generate power, transmit it, and distribute it if we have the capacity to engage in transmission and distribution. That has been introduced now, and so Nigerians are free to go into investment into the power sector. H, that the bill will promote indigenous capacity in technology for renewable energy sources through a framework for local content in the Nigerian electricity supply industry, as well as promote public education on renewable energy production and consumption to increase the generation and consumption of electricity from renewable sources. I, that the bill will provide a clear framework for cross-border electricity trade in the interest of national security and energy self-sufficiency, as well as promote frameworks for security of electricity infrastructure, prescribe effective punitive measures against electricity theft and other offenses peculiar to the Nigerian electricity supply industry. Like I said before, we now have a tribunal that is specifically meant to address issues of electricity theft and peculiar issues that only relate to the power sector. J, that the passage of the bill will portray the Senate as a responsive and resilient lawmaking institution before Nigerians and the global community that the Senate of the Federal Republic of Nigeria is committed towards ameliorating the dwindling fortunes of the country's power sector, which has been the bane of economic development in this country. Mr. President, these are the findings and recommendations that are incorporated in the bill that we are about to pass now. Recommendations. The Senate Committee on Power, to which this bill was referred, having considered the bill, hereby recommend as follows: that the Senate do consider and pass the Electricity Bill 2022 as amended. I so move, Mr. President. Conclusion.
We're taken over by some banks that this discourse owed so much money. That changes the landscape, because banks, or let me say those banks, do not have the capacity, the wherewithal to run the discourse. What happens with our discourse now in the hands of banks? Are they going to privatize them again, or government should look into it and do the privatization once again? I don't know, just respond to this.
Yeah, Mr. President, we're taking over, but not strictly by the banks. You know that in all of the discourse, government retained 40% equity in those shareholdings. So the takeover of those entities is in collaboration with the banks, NEC, and BPE. In fact, the appointment of the interim managements of those entities is actually screened, approved by BPE and NEC. That is NEC and BPE acting on behalf of government. So what is going to happen? This bill has made adequate provision for such eventualities or such situations in the bill. In the Reform Act, we didn't have that. And we had envisaged that those kind of things will come. So this bill have taken care of situations that will arise so that we don't get into a quagmire. And so what is happening now is that those entities that have been taken over, management have been set up. NEC is meeting with the equity shareholders, with BPE, in order for them to invite new investors who have the capacity to do that. But that will be done in conjunction with government with 40% shareholding. If we look at the management, BPE have nominated, that is government have nominated 2 management staff on those new management, interim management that have been set up. So there is going to be, of course, new investors that will be invited. They will come in and take over. For instance, Abuja Electricity they have not settled, but UBA took them over. But there is an investor that has been on it for them to take over Abuja Distribution Company. So for the 5 that have been taken over, similar arrangement will be put in place for them. But there are transitional measures so that we don't run into a situation where this will be completely come to a halt. There are transitional measures for them to continue running until such arrangements are put in place.
Government has only 40%, like you said. They could not pay back the monies, and banks took over 60%. If government is now the one appointing those to manage, are we saying that we are going to privatize this discourse again, or why wouldn't government cleanse off and leave the 40% so that we have better environment for managing this?
Yeah, Mr. President,